Okay, thanks everybody for your indulgence. We are back in public session. So now we will move on to, item 5.1. So our first item on the agenda is the report from the Parent Involvement Advisory Committee on January 21st, 2025. And the topic is the suspension of school council operations. We have invited the PIAC co-chairs, Sarah Ali and Zina Sherrick, to speak on this report, but I don't know. They were not available to attend today. So who am I passing this to discuss this item? Or sorry.
Draft.
No, seriously. Okay, okay, there's no one speak directly to the item. So is there a mover and a seconder to put the recommendations from the report on the?
Trustee Pay, Madam Chair.
Yeah. Needs a seconder. Yeah, okay. So without a seconder, can we adjust the screen, please? Sorry, without a seconder, the report is not tabled on the floor. But because the matter under consideration in the PIAC report is in front of the courts as a legal challenge, this matter will be set aside until such time as the legal challenge is resolved. And we do not have a date for that at this time. So.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
No.
So just for clarification, you said this is a legal challenge regarding this motion here?
No. Sorry, Trustee Pay. So there is a legal challenge which is posted publicly on this same topic. So not this motion. Sorry, there is not a legal challenge on this motion. There is a legal challenge that is posted publicly on this topic, and so the discussions that we just had in private is that this matter has to be set aside until that legal challenge is completed. And a decision on this topic will actually come from the courts at that time.
Okay, Madam Chair.
So the next item on our agenda is item 6.1. And that is.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I haven't finished my question yet.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, I think you mentioned there's some legal challenge associated with this item here. So what is it? Through you, may I ask the staff to give us trustees
Trustee
a
Pay,
clarification regarding that? Yeah,
that's the discussion we just had in private.
I understand, and in private. So if it's an illegal challenge, assume this illegal challenge item already is being open to public, right?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll pass the microphone to Executive Officer Jennifer Saville to respond.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, given that this is an ongoing legal proceeding before the courts, we will not be discussing this in public. Thank you.
Okay, so we're not going to discuss it. At least, like as trustee, do I have the right to know what is the legal challenge or legal matter? What is the matter, by the way?
Yes, but not in public session.
Pardon me, Trustee Pay, and through
Yeah.
you, Madam Chair. Trustee Pay, this matter was discussed in full in private session immediately preceding this discussion, and the matter cannot be discussed further in public. And you would need to go through appropriate procedures internally if you wish to bring the matter back for discussion in private, but the matter cannot be discussed at this time.
Okay, just for clarity, through you, Madam Chair. So this is matter, does have some kind of association with this motion tabled by PIAC committee. Am I correct?
Sorry, the matter is not on the floor, trustee Pei. It did not get a seconder, so it has failed for want of a second. And we are on item 6.1. I would suggest that you contact our executive officer, Phil, for more information on the proceedings.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. So our next item is actually item 6.2, which is the bylaws review subcommittee. It says, sorry, my notes say report number 1, but this is report number 2, right? Yeah, report number 2 from February 26, 2025. And if we have any questions, we have our subcommittee chair, trustee Laskin. Are there any questions on this report? Trustee Laskin, go ahead.
No, I have none. I'm happy to move receipt.
Okay. So we need a seconder for receipt. Trustee Ghost. Thank you. So the items on the floor for receipts, all in favor?
Aye.
We're doing this verbally?
Or are we using these?
Okay, sorry, we'll do this one verbally. So all in favor for receipt of item 6.2? Aye.
Aye.
Online?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thanks. That carries. Our next item on the agenda is 7.1. And this is policy P021, the fundraising policy, phase 5. It's on page 19 of your agendas. And I would like to invite staff to speak to this item. Mr. Green?
Go ahead.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll ask Gary Green, our senior manager, who has carried this project through, to present the report.
Thank you. And through the chair, I'd like to thank the policy team, the educational business partnership team, and everyone who's kindly offered suggestions on how to improve the fundraising policy. As a refresher, the fundraising policy was last reviewed in 2003, so it's well overdue. In May of 2023, staff provided preliminary provisions at GPC and was approved to move forward to drafting and consultation. Consultations occurred between May and October and included a survey for further feedback. The survey was completed by 323 respondents, and some key questions were asked as to whether there is a preference for a mandatory versus a voluntary approach to contributions to a central system priorities fund. The feedback provided was strongly in favor of a systems priorities fund and strongly in favor of it being voluntary. Of the respondents, 54% favored the implementation of a new fund, a system priorities fund, 30% disagreed, 16% had no opinion. 60% indicated that the fund should receive voluntary donations, while 30% said mandatory and 10% had no opinion. Last year at stage 5, staff was asked through a trustee motion to reconsider one aspect of the policy, specifically to look at whether or not contributions to the System Priorities Fund should be done in a way that involves mandatory contributions from school councils. As you have the accompanying report that outlines the full motion, I'd just like to focus on the mandatory versus voluntary aspect of the motion. Staff was asked to consider options for mandatory contributions to the System Priorities Fund of over a certain threshold of funds raised be added to policy P021, fundraising. What was intended was to look at a process where threshold be considered, after which every dollar raised beyond that level by school councils would have a percentage or flat rate amount redirected to the System Priorities Fund. In response to the motion, staff started out with a review of the mandatory versus voluntary, within a surplus funds model and sought legal considerations of such an approach. It was made clear to us by legal, and you heard more detail earlier, that whether we select a mandatory or voluntary approach, it is not possible to do within a surplus funds approach. Specifically, the legal review indicated the requirements for transparency and accountability may be difficult to meet within a surplus funds approach because the threshold amount would have to be defined for each fundraising endeavor to which it would apply. Further, if the board is considering a mandatory approach, the legal review has stated that an approach that would be more likely to meet the transparency and accountability requirements would be to designate a set portion of every dollar raised at schools or the board through fundraising initiatives to the System Priorities Fund. However, there are some challenges with mandating that a portion of every dollar raised in the system be directed to the fund, including the risk of schools missing fundraising targets, risk of non-compliance, and the requirement for additional staff effort to track and audit funds. I have not included a recommendation from staff in the report, just items to consider in terms of making the decision. Pages 3 and 4 of the accompanying report provides additional details on the legal considerations and potential concerns with this approach. We are now requesting direction with respect to which option is preferred. So staff is recommending that one of the following options regarding the System Priorities Fund be approved. One would be the System Priorities Fund and the revised fundraising policy proceed with a mandatory contributions process, or the System Priorities Fund in the revised fundraising policy proceed with a voluntary contribution process, and that subject to the above decision, the fundraising policy will be revised to include that and then to be approved. We welcome any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. First, we have Trustee Rajkula-Singham.
Thank you through the chair. Thank you for this report. I just had one question on this. I understand that when it comes to the fundraising policy, we need to share, every dollar and what it's being fundraised for at the school level. But what about for the System Priorities Fund? So would we need to specify what items are being raised through that fund? Or if we specify it's for that, if it's for that fund, it's enough? Or do we need to specify what we're raising monies for via that fund?
Through the chair, if I understand the question, I think what you're asking is, do we have to indicate specifically what everything in the System Priorities Fund will be directed toward? Is that correct?
Correct. I'm just trying to understand because I know we have to be very clear and transparent in what we're fundraising for. So would we need to spill out in the Systems Priorities Fund, is it going towards outerwear? Is it going towards hot meals? Or is it enough to say that it's going towards this Systems Priorities Fund and that's enough?
Through the chair, my understanding is that similar to how organizations will have a general fund, you may specifically donate to certain items and then you can donate to general, which will give discretion. I believe that this would be the same thing and subject to any legal opinion otherwise. That would be my perspective. Having said that, I do believe that in previous documents, we've indicated that we will be putting surveys out to the system to ensure that we know what the needs are there, and there will be accountability that goes with that as well.
Thank you. And through the chair, and following after those funds have been allocated, would we prepare a report of some sort sharing maybe annually what the System Priority Fund has initiatives it has supported, maybe areas it has supported? Are we thinking of doing something like that? Just to reinforce, I know there's some folks have some concern around how funding will be allocated or distributed. So perhaps this type of reporting would increase people's trust in how in this process.
Through the chair, I appreciate the question, and certainly when the school generated funds report goes out annually, this would be a great way to add to that. We do want to demonstrate to the community and to parents and to caregivers that we are accountable for the funds and that every dollar can be accounted to. And what is great about this as well is 100% of all of the money raised goes directly to the students.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Next, we have trustee Dawson.
Thank you through the chair. Thank you for this report. I guess I'm struggling a bit with this decision without understanding exemptions and sort of who was involved specifically in this consultation. So I have a few questions. So the first is 300 some odd participants in a survey. Do we know which parts of the city that those respondents were from?
Through the chair, we don't have exact data in terms of where they were from. We did consult with all of the committees as required, and the survey was a supplement to that. So in addition to the consultations, and we have heard from the community in a number of different ways, and the message has resonated and has been quite clear in terms of where they stand with respect to the voluntary versus mandatory. Having said that, staff has not made a recommendation one way or the other, and it has left it to trustees based on your feedback of your communities as well.
Okay. If we were to go with I'm just trying to understand exemptions. Like, would we look at model schools being exempt? Would we look at certain initiatives being exempt? So for instance, school grounds improvement initiatives? Or is this just a cut and dry percentage of every dollar for everyone in every situation?
Through the chair, and again, if there are legal opinions to the contrary, I'd like to hear that. What we had proposed was a percentage off every dollar raised, because that would be one way to be able to communicate that this is fair and consistent everywhere, and then people know exactly where their dollars are. I don't know if there's anything further to add from a legal perspective.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. If you would like a legal opinion, we will have to go into private, but I can, of course, advise that any policy or procedure would go through a legal review, and we would ensure that it did comply with the board's legal obligations.
Okay. Thank you. That's enough. We don't have to go into private, but I did just want to flesh out. So it is 100%. So is it correct to say that if a school has a target of raising $200,000 for a school grounds improvement initiative, that X% could be taken off of that as well? So every single fundraising initiative, no exceptions. Is that correct?
Through the chair, it would be the trustees that would direct us in terms of how to do that. I think that the legal opinion indicated that one way to do so in a way that's defensible would be to take a percentage off of every dollar. But I believe that would be better handled for legal with respect to the direction that trustees wish to provide to us. That would be open to the trustees to indicate.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned additional resources might be needed to track and, develop I was just wondering, what do you mean by additional resources? Like an additional people power, like more staff? I don't understand what additional resources means.
Through the chair, if we are tracking the amount of dollars that are fundraised in the entire system, we will need to ensure that we validate those numbers before we take a percentage, just in terms of procedural fairness. And so that's what is being indicated. It will take time to ensure that we're drilling down at every single event to make sure that we're 100% sure of the dollars that have been raised.
Okay, but would we need, sorry, through the chair, would we need more staff to do that? I'm just trying to gauge the budgetary impact of it.
Through you, Madam Chair, this would take additional staff resources because as what Mr. Green commented to, we would have to go out to the schools and audit to ensure that we understood the amounts that were collected and then do the transactions to move a portion of that into the central fund, as well as then we would have to work on the central fund. So I do see this as additional resources, both in the audit side of it, but as well as in the training and maintenance of the program, if it was mandatory.
Okay. I'm confused if there's a budget attached to why this isn't going to FBEC.
We haven't made a decision.
Through you, Madam Chair, I think we would be awaiting the decision of the committee, which way they, and then the board to approve, because if it's going to be voluntary, the cost would be negligible, if any. So until the committee makes a decision, it's difficult to assess, and the board approves that decision, it's difficult to assess at this point in time. And given the high percentages of respondents said they like to see a voluntary program, we haven't done that depth of a review yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, Trustee Siskandraja, can you confirm that you're in the meeting?
Present.
Thank you. Welcome. And Trustee Nunziata?
Trustee Nunziata also present.
Awesome, thank you. And next we have Trustee Laskin.
Thank you very much. Through you, Madam Chair, to staff. I remain completely committed to voluntary, and at the appropriate time, Madam Chair, I'd like to move that. But I have a couple questions for staff in terms of voluntary allocation to the System Priority Fund. I have many schools that actually do portions of fundraising already for others, not necessarily to a system fund, but potentially to a school, potentially supporting school uniforms at a different school, supporting other events at a different school, co-joining for fundraising events and splitting the funds, et cetera. Is any of that precluded from a systems priority fund?
Through you, Madam Chair, no, none of that would be precluded. And we would also, in our procedures and in our training out to the system, would ensure that schools knew about the System Priority Fund and its intent, and try to advertise it as a venue as well, that if they did not, they had a wish to donate and it wasn't directly to another school, but they wanted to help coats for students, for example, that venue is available to them as well.
Thank you then, through you, Madam Chair, again to staff. So any of the system things that we do now, like in the fall, we do backpacks. In the winter, we tend to do winter clothing. Would a System Priority Fund cancel those specific targeted fundraisers that we do as a system? Through you, Madam Chair, to staff.
Through the chair, no, they wouldn't cancel that, though we would expect that the System Priorities Fund could support those priorities that are identified by the system.
Excellent. In the procedures, therefore, one of the things that I think that regardless of which direction the board goes is the accountability and the transparency, not only for school communities on specific school fundraising, but from a system when we have our reports, because there really is I think there's a lack of awareness of what the board does to try to differentiate funding, knowing that some schools can fundraise more than other schools, and what a support, frankly, those schools do provide to the board. They fundraise for projects that otherwise the board would have to take out of their scarce funds. So we can direct those to other schools that don't necessarily have fundraising dollars, as we do, for example, to school grounds based upon LOI, some other facilities based upon LOI, et cetera. So in the procedures then, would there be clarity provided in terms of accountability to principals? What the system would hold principals accountable for within their schools, and then how that then would get rolled up to the system report that we do annually? Through you, Madam Chair, to staff.
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, the procedure will to be developed that outlines the principal's responsibilities with around fundraising. And we will also, working with Stephanie Harris, our Controller of Finance, will develop the reporting module so that that information can be pulled up into our annual reporting to the board on what fundraising happened and was to the system fund, or whether it's in the school.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, to staff. There were some issues during this past year, not issues, but awareness raised on some of the procedure changes with regard to serving alcohol at school fundraising events, using barbecues for fundraising events, et cetera. Those seem to be resolved. Will they carry forward through the procedures in this new policy, or will we have to relitigate those again? Through you, Madam Chair, to staff.
Through the chair. Yes, they were both fun discussions. The alcohol one was resolved by referring to the alcohol policy. So that's a separate thing altogether, not a fundraising specific policy. And so we'll defer to that other policy. With respect to the barbecue, that was actually a health and safety policy as well, of which fundraising is slightly impacted. So that will continue as is as well.
Okay, thank you. So the updated procedures, through you, Madam Chair, to staff, there should be when all is said and done, there should be a really transparent, my colleague Donna Cansfield used to say, Canadian Tire language pamphlet or discussion or information provided to school councils, all parents, et cetera, that's very public in terms of what fundraising is, what fundraising isn't, et cetera. And I think it's also important to say right from the policy what all fundraising should, like use the language directly out of the policy that as a subtitle in any advertisement that, you know, funds must know where they're directed to, et cetera, and that we hold principals accountable for ensuring that level of transparency and accountability. Through you, Madam Chair, to staff, I'm hopeful to see that.
Yes, through you, Madam Chair, we definitely agree with that. We will, as we write the policy and then as we create the working documents for our schools and school councils, as well as training, we will make sure that's effectively communicated to all our stakeholders so that everybody understands. And as always, Gary and his team are available to answer any questions schools may have if a specific question comes up.
Thank you very much. And then my last question has to do with expectations in terms of what fundraising needs to happen versus what we provide in school budgets that shouldn't be fundraised for, and what ministry provides that shouldn't be fundraised for. So will there be, Madam Chair, some clarification for school communities on what the system expectation of school budgets is to be used for versus in addition to, like, I have heard from schools, rightly or wrongly, that, you know, they have to fundraise for toilet paper. They have to fundraise for it used to be hand sanitizer, or they have to fundraise for pencils, or teachers have to use their own money for paper, et cetera. Will part of the communication include clarity over the expectations for school budgets versus fundraising dollars? Through you, Madam Chair, that's my last question as my time is up.
Through you, Madam Chair, the short answer is yes. When we prepare the documentation, as an example, the ones that the trustee brought forward, but also the one that the fundraising dollars shouldn't be to paid salaries. So those kind of exceptions will be allowed out in the fundraising procedure.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next is trustee Pay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I just want to ask the staff's opinion on this. I heard the staff is mentioned that the mandatory proportion of the motion to the system plus fund may have less issues, but have financial indication that require resources. For the volunteer part, this has less constraint in terms of human resources. So I just want to understand, we have a legal opinion here. So what's the legal opinion really make a recommendation to the board? Through you, Madam Chair.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll pass the mic to Executive Officer Jennifer Saville to respond.
Thank you. And through the chair, I would like to remind trustees that if you would like a legal opinion from legal counsel or to discuss a legal opinion, we will have to go in private. Anything shared in a private session should remain in private. Thank you.
Trustee Pay.
Madam Chair, I'm
Helps.
not discussing the legal matter because on the agenda, page 22, there are legal considerations, right? So I'm just asking staff regarding this part of legal consideration. So what are these, the consideration? So what's conclusion regarding after, the legal staff made all those consideration for legal part? So what's conclusion for that?
Thank you. And through the chair, Trustee Pay, on page 22 of the agenda, there are certain legal considerations. They provide guiding principles, best practices with respect to fundraising initiatives. And most importantly, they talk about the requirement under the regulations and the guidelines to have fundraising initiatives that are transparent, accountable, and that fundraising funds or initiatives are used for their designated purpose.
Okay, my next question would be, through Madam Chair, after consider all this legal part of the principles, practice, accountability, transparency, would the staff recommend mandatory or voluntary contribution to the system and plus fund?
Through you, Madam Chair, I believe that question has been answered in the earlier presentation, that staff are not making a recommendation. The question has been posed to trustees to provide direction as to the how you'd like to proceed, and then staff will build the policy and attendant procedures accordingly.
So, sorry, to clarify, Trustee Pay, staff have provided us the background information. And for trustees who may have missed it, Executive Officer Saville did send a private document that's password protected that has the external legal opinion that you can open and read now if you need to as well. But so staff have provided the background information. There's two options that the board can decide, but they've left it to us as trustees to choose one of these options based on the background information. And staff are not actively making a recommendation for A or B. They've just provided us the information for us to make that decision.
Okay, if that's the case, Madam Chair, I want to move a motion to go back to private. I want to discuss this legal piece. I want to understand more about legal recommendations here. Thank you.
Can we just go back into private? Okay, we have to clear the room for that. Actually, can I ask Trustee Pay? Can I ask?
Yeah.
We have two more speakers on the list. Can we?
Yeah.
We'll just get through those questions, public questions, and then go back into private.
Sure, Madam
Okay.
Chair, very much.
Thank you. So next we have trustee Siskandaraja.
Thank you. So just wanted to share that I'm in favor of option mandatory contributions. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. I think that you know, if we pass A, that I don't know if approving the fundraising policy right now, or if this is something we take care of when we do the procedure. We can have those conversations, but I think we're still not where we need to be. I think we still, you know, Trustee Dawson brought up some interesting questions around exceptions. I don't think, and those are conversations we need to continue to have. This is a very important policy. As we saw, it hasn't been revised for a very long time. And so I think we need to move on this matter with great care. I think, you know, doing a percentage makes sense to me. I mean, if that's one of the options, and it seems like that's the option that is now being proposed, I think exceptions are definitely needed, right? I think, and we can have those conversations, whether it's exceptions for model schools, exceptions for, you know, certain things. So I think this is an ongoing conversation, and I don't think it's being framed in that way. I think it's sort of, we have to make this decision and then it just goes into effect. I don't think an issue this nuanced should be handled in that way. Also, I believe that what I'm hearing from staff, it sounds very punitive, and that is not the intent of this mandatory contribution. The idea of the mandatory contribution is to cultivate a culture where it's normalized to give and we do this all levels of government, right? We have equalization payments, we have income taxes, a progressive income tax system. So this is not new. It's not meant to be punitive. So I think this idea that we need to have staff allocated to go in and do forensics accounting on people, schools, the way that schools are conducting their budget is not the end goal here. It's to create a culture and based on good will, and sort of we can see how it, you know, proceeds and see how we can sort of manage. I don't think we should jump to the conclusion that people are not going to, schools are not going to want to do this. Schools are going to try to hide money. I don't think that's sort of the narrative I'm hearing. I don't think that's the intention, but that's how it sounds. And it's not meant to be punitive. I don't think we need to go to those extremes. It's just about setting that culture, and I think people will come on board. And I know there's been a lot of reference to the consultations, but we've had this conversation many a times. This policy has come to us many of times, and we've had, you know, we've had concerns, right, with any consultations. It's a small pool. Those that are able to fundraise more are probably the ones more likely to fill out the consultation. So there's sort of a lot of barriers inherent into that process to give it more weight. At the end of the day, we as trustees have to make these you know, complicated decisions, because if not, what's the point of us being here? So I'm in full support of mandatory contribution. How that rolls out, I think there's a lot of room for discussion on that. I don't think we need to be rushed into that. I appreciate the comments from trustees about schools doing volunteer contributions, and that's great. And I know there are schools that do that, but there's a lot of schools that don't. And oftentimes it's, you know, they don't know. They might, you know, for whatever other reasons. So I think this isn't, I don't think this is going to have a pushback the way that perhaps it's being perceived. I think, of course, there will be certain schools perhaps that won't like it at the beginning, but you know, that's with anything where, you know, mandatory withdrawal of funds. But again, I think we have room for conversations around exceptions and sort of what percentage or what that would look like. So I just wanted to share my thoughts at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have trustee McLean.
Thank you, and through the chair. I guess I just have a simple question. It goes back centuries ago when I used to run fall fairs at school council and whatnot. So I have a question around the mandatory contribution concept. If the school community spends $2,000 in hiring for inflatables and ponies and whatever you might spend it on, and then it generates $10,000 worth of revenue, would the mandatory contribution pertain to the $8,000 profit, or would it pertain to the $10,000 that was taken in?
Through the chair, I think that would have to be clarified in the procedures. It's not spoken specifically to in the policy.
Right, but this is the, and again, through the chair, this is my challenge with the whole board's approach to policy and procedures. Trustees create the policy, staff creates the procedures, and we don't understand. We're trying to do something, and then what we actually do, we don't learn about it until after the fact, until staff interpret and execute procedures. And then it comes around again, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 22 years, so that you get to see actually what you're accomplishing. So I think it would be beneficial for people to understand what the approach would be before the decision, which path we went down.
So through the chair, my assumption would be net in terms of what you were taking. Having said that, there'd be more clarity in the procedures.
Okay, no, I think it's an important thing to talk about. But it's just so that everybody understands, that's all, because I think net versus gross is an important component here. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair, just to be clear, I would suggest we would use net because you're correct, Trustee McLean. If they had put $2,000 worth of effort to raise the 10,000, it'd be unfair for them not to be able to cover that cost before we took a mandatory deduction away.
Through you, Madam Chair, just adding that I think that the answer you just got is the only answer that really makes sense in this case. Under normal circumstances, when any school fundraises or any school council fundraises, they have to pay out their costs for the renting the barbecue or any other costs that are incurred. And then it's the remainder that would be allocated. So if a mandatory consideration is being looked at here, it would only make sense that it be off the net.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's good and that's helpful through you, Madam Chair. But I know like when it can get a little complicated, because I know when schools are having big events, they might have a silent auction over here and food generation over there, and then ticket sales, and so it can get a little tricky. But I do think that the concept of net versus gross is important, and I too agree that net would be the appropriate way to go for what that matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I pass the chair? Thanks. So I just have one question that's popped up. If we ended up with, a mandatory, and the best practice scenario is dollar for dollar for the system for fundraising, what happens to like Terry Fox and Heart and Stroke fundraisers? Because we have a lot of, I would say most of our schools participate in that, like Toonies for Terry and those sort of things that are not meant for the school or our system. But I noted in the language in terms of the recommendations, it talked about, or the considerations, is that to do this transparently and properly with a dollar for dollar, it would have to be everything that we do as a board, whether it's local schools or systems or like every fundraising would have to fall under this criteria.
So through you, Madam Chair, a couple of points of clarification. Yes, for Terry Fox Run, for example, or Skip Hart Rope for Heart, I always get that phrase wrong. Those would go dollar for dollar because they're not a fundraising for the school, they're a fundraising for a broader thing. And secondarily, in the policy or the procedure, we will talk about that for certain fundraising, not so much Terry Fox, but other ones, donating directly to the organization also is effective for the parents or the community. But yes, for those type of events where it's not for the school, it would go to the funds that were raised, as long as it's communicated that way to the parents as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll take the chair back and we have Trustee Luskin, you had some more questions?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. When people were talking about mandatory, they were also talking about exemptions. From my perspective, that's not mandatory. Mandatory is everything. If there are exemptions, then it's no longer mandatory. That's just my perspective. My other perspective is if it is mandatory, is there a maximum of which schools would be expected to contribute?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's a difficult, I think, to say there be thresholds because it had to be explained that way as well to the parents. It's something we can look at because I agree that if you have a very large fundraising and we're saying, for example, 1% versus a smaller one, but we'd have to be very clear in the procedure about that, and we'd have to make sure it's communicated to our families as well.
Right. From my perspective, mandatory completely defeats the whole purpose of voluntary fundraising, and I will not be supporting it.
Thank you, Trustee Shan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you. Currently, when school councils fundraise, what is the kind of hidden cost that we incur in the system right now? Have we made any kind of, in-kind support, like the, principal time, staff time, using of our accounting system, using our charity status and everything else? Has that been ever calculated before?
Through you, Madam Chair, we have indirect costs, obviously, both for the principal's time, the school staff's time, as well as central staff. But I will point out that under the public sector broader accounting standards, as well as the ministry reporting requirements, it is an obligation of the board to report on fundraising and school-generated funds as part of our financial statements. So the work is, regardless of the process, is still work we need to do.
So through you, Madam Chair, right now, if schools fundraise, they are not at this point contributing any amount to offset any of those costs.
Through you, Madam Chair, no. The fundraising dollars are used 100% for the school's purpose they raise them.
Okay. Is it possible through you, Madam Chair, to understand that a percentage that is being taken mandatorily from fundraising is not a mandatory contribution, but mandatory that reflects on the kind of costs that are associated with fundraising that the system puts in, that in an equitable system that would be disproportionately impacting, schools that need more. Like, for example, if there's a charity that is helping to fundraise for a cause, there's always that operational cost that is incurred, that is often taken into consideration. And even if it means like 5% or 3%, sometimes it's 10%. So if you're looking at a percentage that is less than 5% in terms of mandatory contribution, that is very much usually in line with, in fact, it wouldn't even cover the kind of expenses that are incurred by using school space, by using all of the, I know they're helping the school, but I think it is still shouldn't be seen as completely something that is out of scope in order to eliminate inequities that our whole system is facing. Has that type of analysis been taken into consideration?
Through you, Madam Chair, I would say the answer is no. We would like to see every dollar raised through fundraising going to support our students and the schools. So we don't take the principal's time or the central staff's time into account because, again, we support 100% of the costs being supportive of a program.
And through the chair, furthermore, the dollars raised cannot support those that the ministry already supports. And so the ministry is funding the principal's salary and other things. And so fundraised dollars cannot be used for those that are otherwise covered by the ministry.
Thank you. My suggestion is not for it to be used, but I'm assuming it is still time spent. In fact, a redirection of funds from one school to another school by a small percentage can be. I'm just doing social accounting and looking at not looking at it as a charity model. For example, if a school is extensively involved in fundraising and they're fundraising a lot of money, that's great for the school, but it's also probably disproportionately higher amount of staff time that is allocated within that particular time from a in-kind contribution of the TDSP as a system towards that. So I think a small percentage that is mandatory could be very well understood to be in line with additional support and space and charity and charitable status and all the other things that come with a system that supports to use that as an organization to redirect some of those funds to places where it's needed. I understand voluntary is great. I also understand that a school fundraising for another school is beautiful, and it's such a nice things to do. But I also think that will increase stigma. Like if there's neighborhood and you have school very close, one block from each other, one affluent school fundraises, these are kids who are going to be interacting in the same community, and that doesn't go well in terms of a kind of a stigma that could be in terms of the receiving end. So in order to not feed those charitable kind of mindsets that continue to keep a classist elite approaches in some of our spaces, a better model, even though it's great that a school could be fundraising, but if they're going to be actually fundraising to say that they're fundraising for uniform for this particular school, I would rather that they do it in general and give it to a fund that helps them to understand that this is what it's being used for, but not necessarily be doing it for a particular. I don't know if I'm making it clear, but it is one of those things that could lead to already inequities and already systemic issues in neighborhoods, and then disproportionately high and low fundraising amounts, and then added to that this particular bit of a charity, we are there to provide. It's the building the well in Africa kind of mindset, as opposed to removing racial inequities and the wealth that's got stolen from Africa being in a social justice model to provide. So I do feel that there's pitfalls in that model, and I do think mandatory in a very small section just reinforces the kind of principles of equity.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Dawson?
Thank you. Through the chair, I have a few more questions of clarification, because I'm, to be honest with you, I'm quite confused. It seems like there are too many variables for me as to what goes into A in order to make an educated decision here. What is included in the System Priorities Fund, and how is it dispersed? Through the chair.
Through the chair, currently the System Priorities Fund, or the central funds, are for the backpacks and school supplies, as well as outerwear. So general needs that many schools have, and they're distributed according to people making requests for those. What we had proposed in a previous meeting, and to be more articulated more in the procedures is to do a survey out to the system on a semi-regular basis, requesting what they feel the greatest needs are in their school, and then adapting from a year-to-year basis accordingly.
Okay, that's helpful. What is the percentage that staff are proposing?
Through the chair, there is no proposal with respect to the percentage. I would say at this point in time, this is a conceptual discussion as to whether or not trustees feel it should be mandatory or voluntary, and then trustees would then be able to set that percentage as well. A challenge we have in reviewing it is that there is no other model like this in the country. From what we've reviewed, there's no mandatory provisions in any of the policies that we were able to find. And so we weren't able to extrapolate from others what might happen in this area as well.
Okay, thanks. So just going back to the budgetary implications, so just from a process perspective, let's say A passes. It then goes to FBEC for us to determine whether we can afford the additional resources. And if we can't, then this motion is ultimately defeated. I'm trying to understand what happens next from the budgetary implications with A through the chair.
Through the chair, I will say that if the trustees pass a policy, then it is up to staff to implement the policy. And therefore, if there are resources required to implement it, then we will have to add it to the budget and then it would be approved through the budget process. But again, I think what you're hearing is that there would be additional resources required. There would be a budget impact. It would go through FBEC, but if the policy has been passed, then we would have to implement the policy.
Okay, that's where I really struggle with this decision, because if you tell me the implication is $10,000 versus $1 million, like it's so arbitrary. Without knowing the budgetary impact at this very moment, it's difficult to make this decision because there are budgetary implications. So I'm not understanding why we're not being brought that at this point in time.
Through you, Madam Chair, I would estimate that it would approximate, and again, it's hard because we don't know how much there would be, but I would say you're probably looking at one staff member and associated expenses, so probably around 120 to 150,000.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful. And then I guess, just kind of going back to Trustee Hastings' concern about, some of the schools that are only able to raise a couple $100 or whatever, so a percentage off would make a huge difference to them. I hope that we would take that into consideration when determining the percentage. And I guess a compromise could be if you raise below a certain threshold, 1% is taken off. If you raise above a certain threshold, 5% is taken off. Like, are we considering those types of tiered options at all?
Through the chair, would we be able to discuss that when we move to private?
We'll add that one to the list on private.
Thank you. Okay, that's it for now then.
Okay, thank you. Trustee King.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I just wanted to echo what we heard from Trustee Siskandaraja earlier. I think that for me, in considering the mandatory option, there just sounds like there is way more to be discussed. I hear the questions that my colleagues are raising, and they're being positioned as questions for staff when I think a lot of these are actually questions for us to be discussing and resolving in terms of parameters, percentages, and that. And I think that throughout this process, something that I don't think we've seen yet that I know I would find helpful is having some examples of models and calculations that put together some of the conceptual ideas that we're talking about, the questions that are coming up, and giving them an actual example with calculations. So we could see, for example, if 1% as one model was coming from X amount of schools based on the average fundraising, what would that look like in terms of the contributions from different schools and the contribution to the central fund? And then just being able to have something a little bit more concrete that I think folks could wrap their heads around. And I think that might support some of the conversation in moving it from feeling punitive to really seeing, where the redistribution and support really comes through, and how much benefit it could be versus how little some groups might really miss when they see the actual calculations. So I'm not on the committee, so there's not a decision for me tonight. But I would hope, and it sounds like there'll be some more conversation, and I hope that is something that staff could consider providing. And that's all. Thanks, Chair.
I don't know if there was.
Through you, Madam Chair, if the policy is approved on option A, that as we develop the procedure, we would bring back some information with that report on the procedure on what that looks like when it hits the ground.
Thank you. So Trustee Siskandarajah.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I just have a question for staff. We've approved a lot of sort of policy strategies that require human resources, right? But never have I then been told, or I can't think of a time I've been told by staff that, this is going to now have a budgetary impact, and so it needs to go to FBAC. Why is this the case now all of a sudden? We don't have this conversation when we've done countless other policies that require some sort of human resource or has some sort of human resource implication.
Sorry, through the chair, I apologize if that's what it sounded like. What I said is if this policy is passed, then we will implement it. It will require an additional staff. The way that trustees will see it is that through the budget process, there will be an increase in one additional staff for this purpose.
Okay, thank you. And just want to share that that's sort of, is it fair to say through you, Madam Chair, that that's the case for, anytime we make changes to something that requires more people to work on a file? It's not just unique to this policy.
Through the chair, that's my understanding. Yes, I think that trustees, when they're considering the policy, would consider the costs associated with it, and staff would raise concerns if the resources were too significant in order to be able to pass the policy. As you heard, we're looking at one staff. So, thank you.
Thank you. And like was mentioned, I think this is an ongoing conversation, and I think, I think it's premature to say that we'll need one dedicated staff for a whole year. We still haven't figured out from where I'm sitting. Obviously, I don't have the same expertise, but we still haven't figured out the parameters of what this is going to look like if this passes. And again, my sense I'm getting from trustees speaking today is that we are not trying to go towards a punitive model where we're sending in forensic accounting or things like that. So, I think this has to be an ongoing conversation because I still need more information, like Trustee Dawson mentioned. to wrap around why this would need a full-time staff dedicated just to this. And again, it could be just because we haven't set our parameters yet. But I just wanted to flag that whenever we do make policy changes, they oftentimes have human resource implications. That's all for me at this point.
Okay, if there's no further questions for public, then I need a mover and a seconder to go back into private. If I don't have a mover and a seconder to go back into private, then we need to go to the recommendations that are on the floor.
Trustee Nunziato move.
Sorry, just to clarify, Trustee Nunziata, we have under part number 1, I think we have to do this. Oh, you're moving to go into private? Sorry, I need a seconder.
Yes, to move to go into private.
Thank you. I need a seconder to go into private. Stay on the line. Apparently. Trustee Laskin?
I'll second.
Thank you. All those in favor? Say aye. Any opposed?
I'm against.
Thank you.